There's a pattern in how empires destroy themselves. It's not invasion, it's not revolution, it's overusing the one weapon that made them powerful until that weapon becomes the reason everyone else unites against them. Rome did it with military legions, Britain did it with naval blockades. And right now, in 2026, the United States is doing it with financial sanctions. In 1950, the United States had sanctioned just 2 countries. Today, in 2026, it has active sanctions against nearly 40, touching almost half of the global economy. We've sanctioned Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, Nicaragua, Belarus, Myanmar, Zimbabwe, and dozens more. And here's the paradox that should terrify you. Every sanction we impose makes the dollar more powerful in the short term and less essential in the long term. Because every country we cut off from the dollar system, every asset we freeze, every transaction we block, teaches the rest of the world one lesson. Dollar dependence is a weapon pointed at your throat, and they're building alternatives faster than we're imposing sanctions. This isn't speculation. This is measurable. In 2012, 87% of international transactions used dollars. By 2024, that number fell to 58%. That's a 29 percentage point collapse in 12 years. And the decline is accelerating because sanctions, the weapon that made American power unchallengeable, have become the mechanism of its decline. Let me show you exactly how we built this weapon, why we can't stop using it, and why every sanction we impose now accelerates the end of dollar dominance. Before 1945, economic sanctions were simple. You blocked ships, you stopped trade at borders, physical embargoes that required military enforcement. But after World War II, the United States built something unprecedented. The Bretton Woods system made the dollar the global reserve currency. Every country needed dollars for international trade. And because dollars moved through American banks, through the SWIFT messaging system, through Federal Reserve clearing, the United States controlled the financial plumbing of global commerce. This gave America a new kind of power. We didn't need to blockade harbors. We could simply cut countries off from the dollar system, freeze their assets, block their transactions, make it impossible to trade internationally without facing American banks that would reject the payments. The first major use of this weapon was against Iran in 1979, after the hostage crisis. President Carter froze $12 billion in Iranian assets held in US banks. It was devastatingly effective. Iran couldn't access its own money, couldn't pay for imports, couldn't finance oil sales. The sanctions didn't topple the regime, but they proved the concept. Financial sanctions could cripple an economy without firing a shot. And here's the critical detail. It worked because there was no alternative. If you wanted to trade internationally in 1979, you needed dollars. If you needed dollars, you needed American banks. And if America said no, you were locked out of the global economy. The weapon was absolute. By the 1990s, sanctions had become America's default foreign policy tool. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Sanctions. Yugoslavia descended into ethnic war. Sanctions. Myanmar's military coup. Sanctions. North Korea's nuclear program. Sanctions. We sanctioned Libya, Serbia, Sudan, Afghanistan under the Taliban, and dozens more. And it kept working because dollar dominance was absolute. But here's what changed after 2001. The war on terror gave the US Treasury unprecedented power. The Patriot Act allowed the Treasury to designate any bank, any company, any individual as a threat to national security and cut them off from the US financial system. This wasn't just government to government anymore. This was targeting private banks, corporations, even individuals. If a European bank processed transactions for an Iranian company, the US could fine that bank billions of dollars. In 2014, BNP Paribas paid $8.9 billion for violating sanctions on Sudan, Cuba, and Iran. In 2012, HSBC paid $1.9 billion for processing transactions linked to sanctioned countries. These weren't small penalties. These were existential threats. And the message was clear. If you do business with countries America has sanctioned, you lose access to the American market and the dollar system. Comply or die. And for 20 years, everyone complied because there was still no alternative. But then came the overreach. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. The United States and Europe imposed sanctions on Russian banks, energy companies, and oligarchs. In 2018, President Trump withdrew from the Iran and nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, threatening to punish any country that continued buying Iranian oil. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, the West froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. That last move changed everything. Because freezing a central bank's dollar reserves isn't sanctioning a regime, it's sanctioning the entire concept of holding dollars. Think about what that meant. Russia had followed the rules. They held treasury bonds, dollar reserves in Western banks, playing by the system America designed. And in one decision, those assets were frozen. Unreachable, effectively confiscated. Every other country watched. China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia watched. And they all asked the same question. If it can happen to Russia, why couldn't it happen to us? And here's the answer nobody in Washington wanted to face. It could. Because sanctions are no longer about punishing rogue states. They've become a tool of geopolitical competition. We sanction countries for opposing American policy, for trading with our rivals, for challenging our interests. The weapon that was supposed to be reserved for existential threats has become routine. And every use teaches the world to build alternatives. Let me show you exactly what those alternatives look like. Between 2014 and 2024, China signed currency swap agreements with 40 countries worth over $500 billion. These agreements allow countries to trade in yuan and local currencies without touching dollars. In 2015, China launched the cross-border interbank payment system CIPS, a direct competitor to SWIFT. By 2024, CIPS processed over $12 trillion in transactions annually. When Russia was cut off from SWIFT in 2022, they didn't collapse. They switched to CIPS. Within 2 years, Russia shifted most of its trade away from the dollar, settling transactions in yuan, rubles, and other local currencies instead. The sanction didn't destroy Russia's trade. It destroyed dollar's dominance in Russian trade. And it's not just Russia. In 2023, Saudi Arabia conducted its first oil sale in yuan. Brazil and China agreed to settle all bilateral trade in local currencies. India and Russia created a rupee-ruble mechanism for oil purchases. These aren't marginal countries. These are the 2nd, 6th, 9th, and 12th largest economies on Earth. And they're all reducing dollar exposure simultaneously because sanctions prove that dollar dependence is a vulnerability. The United States created the incentive structure. The sanctioned countries built the alternative. And every new sanction pushes more countries toward that alternative. Here's the math that makes this irreversible. In 2012, central banks held 70% of their reserves in dollars. By 2024, that fell to 58%. In just 2023 alone, central banks sold $200 billion in US Treasury bonds, the largest annual reduction in history. Where did that money go? Central banks began buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. Yuan reserves increased by $87 billion. And bilateral swap lines bypassed reserves entirely. This is a structural shift, not a blip. Every country that diversifies away from dollars reduces global dollar demand. And when demand falls, so does the dollar's value and America's ability to borrow cheaply. We've issued $38 trillion in debt on the assumption that foreign central banks will keep buying treasury bonds. But if they're reducing dollar reserves, who's buying our debt? The answer is the Federal Reserve, printing money to buy our own bonds. That's not sustainable. That's the beginning of a currency crisis. And sanctions are accelerating it because every freeze, every block, every threat pushes more countries to ask why hold an asset that can be weaponized against us. Now here's where the trap closes. The United States cannot stop using sanctions because we've built our entire foreign policy around them. We have no diplomatic leverage in Iran without sanctions, No pressure on North Korea without sanctions. No response to Russian aggression without sanctions. We've become dependent on the weapon. But every time we use it, we teach more countries to build immunity. It's a doom loop. Sanctions work less because alternatives exist. So we impose more sanctions to compensate, which drives more countries to alternatives, which makes sanctions work even less. And the cycle accelerates. In 2010, sanctioned countries represented 8% of global GDP. Today, it's 40%. We've sanctioned our way into irrelevance because you can't sanction half the world and expect your currency to remain indispensable. The network effect that made the dollar powerful, everyone uses it so everyone needs it, reverses. Enough countries build alternatives that not everyone needs it, and once that threshold is crossed, the dollar becomes just another currency. Not worthless, just not essential. And not essential means the end of American exceptionalism. Because everything we've built for 80 years, cheap borrowing, deficit spending, global military presence, economic leverage, depends on dollar dominance. And sanctions are killing it faster than any rival could. This is the weapon that became the mistake. We built the most powerful financial system in history. Then we weaponized it so aggressively that we gave the rest of the world no choice but to build an alternative. And now the alternative exists. See IPS, currency swaps, yuan oil contracts, digital currencies, bilateral trade agreements. The infrastructure is operational. The network is growing, and every sanction we impose accelerates the transition. Because the countries we sanction today are the proof of concept for the countries we might sanction tomorrow. And they're all watching. They're all diversifying. They're all reducing the risk. Here's what that means in practice. In 1990, if America sanctioned you, your economy collapsed. You had no way to trade, no way to access capital, no way to sell commodities. The weapon was absolute. In 2026, if America sanctions you, you switch to yuan trade, join BRICS payment systems, negotiate bilateral currency swaps, and continue operating outside the dollar system. The weapon still hurts, but it's no longer fatal. And that difference between absolute and survivable is the difference between dominance and decline. Because the entire logic of American power rests on indispensability. The moment we're not indispensable, we're just another country with massive debt, crumbling infrastructure, and a military we can no longer afford. And sanctions are proving we're not indispensable anymore. Every country that survives American sanctions without collapsing is proof that dollar dependence is optional. And optional means finished. The tragedy is, we had a choice. We could have used sanctions sparingly, reserving them for genuine existential threats. Terrorism, nuclear proliferation, genocide. Instead, we use them for everything. Trade disputes, political disagreements, geopolitical competition. We turned the nuclear option into standard operating procedure. And now we can't go back because the alternatives are built, the networks are operational, and the world has learned to function without us. Rome overused its legions until the provinces built armies strong enough to challenge them. Britain overused its navy until rivals built fleets that could compete. America overused sanctions until the world built a financial system that doesn't need dollars. The pattern is identical. The outcome is inevitable. And we're watching it happen in real time, one sanction at a time, one frozen asset at a time, one alternative payment system at a time. Empires don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when the systems they built stop being necessary. And once that happens, no amount of power can bring it back.